Okay, all right. I'll turn to the images in just a moment. Let me just finish my train of thought that I was talking to you about. So I was saying to you that you've got this unorganized sector, and I was saying that in a place such as Delhi, for example, I was giving you an illustration of what might be a typical way in which a person might be actually deprived of his or her wages and has no protection. So the simplest illustration would be that in a city like Delhi, in a middle class household, you may have a family that has employed a 24-hour live-in maid. Now, if at the end of that month, whatever the agreement is, if the person gets paid once a month, they don't hand over wages to this woman, what is she going to do? Right? What protections does she actually have? And the gist of the matter is that in the vast majority of these cases, this woman will have absolutely no protection at all. She'll have no protection because she's not a documented worker. The payment that is being made, that is being given to her, the wages, it's all in cash. She doesn't have a bank account. She cannot show, for example, that there is a written agreement which entitles her to these wages, right? And we're not even speaking about the living conditions. We're not speaking about whether she is on call literally 24 hours a day. That is, that what if the employer, let's say a well-to-do couple, they have a party and the party goes on till 4 a.m. at night. Well, is she still responsible at 4 a.m. for cleaning up at that point in time? Or does she simply say that, well, 10 p.m. is the limit and that's how much I'm going to work, and then between 10 p.m. and 8 a.m., that's my own time, right? So if we keep on taking illustrations of this kind, right, we would have obviously millions of such cases. And in a case of this kind, I'm saying that she would be the simplest illustration of what it would mean to belong to the unorganized sector and not to have any protection of the law. Okay, and I'm going to discuss some of the laws that we have, but before I do that, let's look at some of the images, because what I want to do is I want to establish a contrast. And when I say I want to establish a contrast, I don't want to suggest to you, of course, that there hasn't been what is called growth and development in some ordinary sense of the term. Of course, I've offered a critique of the whole ideology of development. And one of the things that I've suggested, one of the things that the Arundhati Roy piece suggests, and I think that this is suggested in the Dress and Reading as well, that development has been not simply uneven, but that there's some people who have had to face the consequences of this ideology of development to an overwhelming extent. So we are interested largely in those people in this sector, because ordinarily when we do a history of contemporary India or a contemporary history of some other culture, what we would usually see is a story which would show you the more progressive elements of that society, what that society has done to advance the interest of its people, so forth and so on. Right? And of course there is a little bit of that. So what you're seeing here is that kind of mall culture that has developed in India recently. There are people like myself, of course, who have been resounding critics of the mall culture, although having lived in India for years, I know that there are unexpected ways in which one can actually find some good even from this kind of culture. And I'll give you a simple illustration of that, because this is partly by way to suggest that even when you see this kind of mall culture developing in India, especially in the urban areas, and when I say urban areas, I don't mean only the big metropolises such as Delhi and Bombay, but I'm talking about even the smaller towns. If you go to Jaipur, if you go to Lucknow, well, these are actually reasonably big cities with several million people, but even if you go to places which have a population of, let's say, 500,000, you'll see the beginnings of a mall culture. Now, even though someone like myself is extremely critical of this culture, I said, there may be some elements in it that you might rescue. What would you rescue? If you happen to belong to the lower middle strata or the lower class in India, you're living in Delhi, temperatures are 115 degrees every day. This is a place you go to for 2 hours to cool off. You just go there just to cool off. You might not do any shopping at all, but cool off, because these are centrally air conditioned. And of course you have to think about, well, are they drawing upon certain reserves of energy Where is the mall getting its water supply from? Where is it getting its electricity supply? Because all around the mall will be neighborhoods, houses, which have no access to electricity and water except for 1 hour a day or 2 hours a day. Right? But nevertheless, if you are the kind of person who feels that, hey, walking on the streets in India is a hazard to my aesthetic sensibility because there's dirt and garbage all over, which there is, no question about that, well, again, you go to the malls because they're spick and span, spotlessly clean. And it's very difficult to tell people that you shouldn't be doing your shopping here because these are the big retailers here. You're going to drive out the small shopkeepers out of business. So I think that when people go to the mall, the Marxist critics will automatically assume that this is the beginning of consumption culture. Yes, it is. It's the beginning of consumption culture. This is the beginnings of global capitalism now in India. You can see that. It's all of that. I agree with the Marxist critic, but I also would like to suggest to the Marxist critic that there might be much simpler, mundane reasons why some people are actually going to these malls. They want to go to a place where they can just roam around for 2 hours and be in an environment where there's no dirt, no litter, and where they can get cooled and refreshed, as it were, for 2 hours every day in the summer. Right? There might be these little reasons. So when we do these cultural histories of these things, it could get quite complicated. Now, one of the major things that has developed in India, I'm sure that some of you have heard about it, is outsourcing. India is one of the world's capitals of outsourcing. And you know what outsourcing means, of course, that you make a call to Verizon, you've got a problem with your phone at 10 a.m. in the morning, this call is actually being picked up by somebody working in an office in one of these malls quite often, or working actually in a building which is adjoining the mall, and that's basically a call center, where Satvinder has been told that he should pretend that he's Sam. And so when you call up Satvinder, who's now pretending that he's Sam, and Sam is pretending that he's actually in Houston, and he'll even ask you about the weather. Okay, and they go through a crash course, a 2-month crash course, where they learn to speak with American accents. So Jaswinder, is going to have a different name. He's going to be Jimmy. Satvinder will be Sam. All right, so forth and so on. And of course, then you have to ask, well, what kind of labor force is that? Is this a new kind of slavery, effectively? Because of course, these people in India, they are staying up from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. They're working the night shift so that people here can live comfortably, effectively. Right? And of course, the reasons why the corporations are outsourcing all of this is because labor is cheap. Right? That's the simplest answer, you could say. But it raises interesting problems that no one really thinks about. One of the things that has happened in the outsourcing industry, call centers, business processing industries, as they're called, one of the things that happened is that there's been a large number of young educated women. And when I say educated here, I'm not talking about highly educated, because if they're highly educated, they're not going to go and work for a call center to begin with. But they're much better educated than women of previous generations. Very often they would have at least a college degree. Certainly high school pass, and very often a college degree, maybe not from the best college, but some mid-level college. And they obviously have some facility in English, because what they're being trained to do is to change their accents and all of that, and to pick up a few Americanisms, how are you doing today, that kind of thing, which is not the way that you would ordinarily speak English, obviously, in India, so forth and so on. Now, what are some of the kinds of problems that develop? Very often, these are women who are the first female in their family for generations to have worked outside the home. They're bringing in a good deal of money, which no male member of the family is able to bring in. So it creates certain anxieties within the family. And let's complicate it a bit more. You're working the night shift from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. You get off at 4 a.m. Okay, you get off at 4 a.m., then there's a whole question of women's safety. What if a woman gets off at 4 a.m., she has to go to her home, which is 10 miles away? Well, how is she going to get there? Okay? And then, of course, there are the psychological, cultural aspects, because it was also always considered to be unwise for a woman to be working late at night, and generally women who worked late night hours were considered to be women who were engaging in conduct that was not appropriate. Because usually the kind of work that would be done in late night hours would be, for example, sex work. So there was a stigma. Now, these women are not doing sex work at all. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about women who are actually working at call centers. They're getting off at 4 a.m. And when they go back to their house at 4:30 a.m., neighbors start to gossip. Hey, what is this woman doing out this late at night? So forth and so on. Right? So when you start to do the history of labor in India, and you start to do the history of gender, all of these kinds of questions will come up, and some of these are relatively new questions, which this society has not really had to face before. So not all the problems that we speak about are problems that go back to 100, 150 years or 200 years. Some of them obviously have their origin in the colonial period. Much of the legislation that we're talking about, that we will be talking about, has its origins in the colonial period. But some of these problems are relatively new. And they have to do with a question that, so I'm starting to address some questions for the next segment as well, because the next segment has to do with women. Some of these questions have to do with women in the public sphere. What happens when women enter into the public sphere? And this, by the way, is a question that was faced in the United States as well. You should not again think that this is a question that has to be faced only by women in countries such as India or the global south. I mean, the best illustration is what happened to women after World War II, because some of you who have studied the social history of the United States might be well aware of the fact that during World War II, a large number of American women for the first time entered the labor force. And they entered the labor force because most of the men were out, obviously, fighting the war, whether it was in the Pacific or in the Atlantic. Okay? Now, at the end of the war, the vast majority of these women went back to the house. They were expected to go back to their homes and expected to resume their domestic duties. And this is why, of course, you needed the next phase of the women's revolution, which was not really until the 1960s. So for 2 decades, effectively, the same women who had gone out into the public sphere, these women were now, okay, pushed back into the house and then had to come back out again 2 decades later, right? That's what we're speaking about effectively. So this question here that you're looking here is not in that sense dramatically different, but obviously the context in which we would have to consider it are strikingly different. Now let's just look at a few images over here. So here you have these malls, and I could give you 50 images, and you know the malls look all the same, no matter where these malls are, whether it's Delhi or Jaipur or Bangalore or whatever the case might be. Okay, so here's another one, just to give you a little illustration. And what we're really talking about is obviously a kind of a homogeneous global culture that has now come into place, right? So you see Dockers, all of that. And now the contrast very suddenly, okay? So what we're going to see now, and I'm going to explain the context for this, is a number of images which have to do with the history of labor in India. So let's begin very briefly with child labor in India. The law in India on child labor, by the way, is very clear in some respects. And I want to remind you of something that I've mentioned in class often, and that is that India has extremely progressive legislation in most areas. And one fundamental problem in India has been that the legislation has never been implemented. In the case of child labor, the legislation is actually rather different, because in India there's long been a debate about whether child labor should be eliminated altogether or not. Because in most of the countries, in fact I would say in all the countries of the industrial north, which would include obviously the United States, Britain, Australia, Western Europe, and certainly in countries like Japan as well, in all of these countries, child labor is prohibited. So if you're under 18 years old, you cannot actually be made to work. In India, the law, which was implemented in 1986, so the most recent piece of legislation that we have is the Child Protection Act in 1986. And what the law of 1986 stipulates very simply is that children under the age of 14 are permitted to work, but they are not permitted to work in hazardous industries. So hazardous industry, best example would be mining. Extremely hazardous, right? The risks involved are enormous. And so that would be a hazardous industry, and children at the age of 14 may not work in a hazardous industry. There's a bill that was introduced into the Indian Parliament in 2012, and what this bill seeks to do is it seeks to bring in more progressive legislation, and what it would do is that it would actually say that you cannot work in a hazardous industry under the age of 18, and you cannot be employed in any non-hazardous industry even under the age of 14. That is, under the age of 14, all child labor would be considered illegal if this bill were to pass. This bill was introduced in 2012. It has still not passed, right? It's still sitting in Parliament. And when we say non-hazardous industries, that would include such things as farm labor. Okay, that's non-hazardous. So that's a distinction, effectively. Now, the debate has to do with the fact that there are people who have argued that the poverty rates in India are so high that you need the income, even of children. And again, let me reiterate that this is exactly the same argument that is going to be encountered in Pakistan, Bangladesh. So here we're speaking about South Asia as a whole. We're not simply speaking of India, but again, the example that we're looking at are examples from India in particular and the legislation there, because there will be legislation in Pakistan and Bangladesh which will be somewhat different. I mean, the case of Bangladesh has been studied at considerable length, and one of the reasons it's been studied at great length, as some of you might be aware, is that Bangladesh is now in some ways the textile manufacturing capital of the world. You know, Dhaka alone has over 5,000 textile industries, okay? And many of the people who come into Dhaka, so Dhaka is the capital of Bangladesh, and many of these people are coming in from the countryside, and they're coming in for the countryside for the usual reasons, that the land cannot support this much number of people, right? Or there might be someone in the family who is severely ill and you need to get extra income. So what do? You have one person in the family who then migrates to the big city, because generally wages in the big city would be somewhat higher than they would be in the countryside. And in the countryside, of course, the main source of sustenance in a country such as Bangladesh is still going to be largely agriculture. So you move into the big city. And then, of course, you might think about the conditions under which the people are working in the big city. To what extent are these conditions really exploitative? Some of you may be aware of the fact that there was a collapse in Bangladesh of this building, this huge building, which basically held these textile workers, and over 1,000 of them died. Right? This was a little bit over a year ago. Right? So many stories of that kind. So that's, again, the context that we're really talking about over here. Okay? And the debate has to do with the fact that if these areas, these rural areas, are so impoverished, we cannot really eliminate child labor in these areas, because even though children are paid a pittance for the work that they do, this is still something that augments the family income. And of course, there are all kinds of contradictions, because on the one hand, as you are aware from the discussion that I had in this class about 2 weeks ago, in India you have the Right to Education Act, which was passed a few years ago. And what does the Right to Education Act say? It says very clearly that all children under the age of 15 or 16 are entitled to free, compulsory, mandatory education, and that the state is obliged to give them this education. On the other hand, you have the Child Labor Act, which I've spoken about, and this says that children under the age of 14 can actually work, but they cannot work in a hazardous industry. Right? So you can see the contradiction. On the one hand, you say that, well, children have the right to education, but what does that right to education mean if, on the other hand, a different act of the government permits children under the age of 14 to actually work? Right? Yes? What's that, sorry?
Can't they just work part-time?
Oh, yeah, of course you can. I mean, we're not looking at all the details. We're not looking at all the details. We're not looking at whether a child is working for 5 hours or 10 hours or 15 hours or 20 hours, right? But we're obviously simply taking the generality of cases and saying that if you have a child who's working, what might be a typical industry in which a child would work? Does anybody know? What would be one of the most common industries? Carpet weaving. Why carpet weaving? Because you need nimble hands to do that work. And children's are supposed to have very nimble hands, that they can do that work a lot better than adults can, and of course you pay them the salary that would be a fraction of what you would pay an adult. Right? But very often when a child starts to work in one of these carpet weaving factories, you find that the working hours are going to be something like 6 to 12 hours a day easily. The likelihood that once you put a child into one of these factories, that this child will then be told in 2 in the afternoon, well, son, now you're ready to go back home and you can go to school for 6 hours, right? It's not going to happen. So those are theoretical considerations in a way, if I may put it this way. Whether a child works part-time or full-time, what we're speaking about is the generality of cases, what happens when children work in these factories, what are the contradictions that are inherent in the system. On the one hand, you say children need to be protected, they're fragile, they need to be educated, and the state is certainly making that concession. On the other hand, you're saying, well, if they're under the age of 14, they should be permitted to work considering the Indian context. And the Indian context, the arguments in favor of child labor are that, well, these children are actually augmenting the incomes of families that are extremely poor. Okay? And of course, we are not going to be able to resolve some of this unless we begin to understand that exactly the same arguments were being made in Europe in the 19th century. So this is why you read Marx. You read Capital, Volume 1, Volume 2, and what do you find out when you read Capital? You find out how is it that the 12-hour working day gradually is going to become a 10-hour working day, an 8-hour working day, and then eventually you're going to have 5 working days a week. Now that didn't happen in Marx's lifetime. That happens later on. But one of the things that Marx is going to document is the tussle between the factory owners and the workers themselves, and the role of the state. So you're talking about 3 factors that you have to think about. You have to think about factory owners, or capitalists if you want to call them that. Then you have to think about the workers, and then you have to think about the role of the state. How does the state mediate in these particular conflicts? Right? Because if we kept on using the argument that children's labor is needed because essentially they're augmenting the incomes of their parents or other adult members of the family, well, we probably are never going to be able to get out of that cycle of child labor. And that is why the illustration of what happened in England in the 19th century may be instructive just to this extent, right? Without looking into obviously the complexities of social history in England itself. So if we just look at these images here, so these are children. I don't know if you know what they're doing. What they're really doing is they're basically crushing these rocks, okay, with their spades and axes, and then they carry them. So why do they crush the rocks? So you can obviously have a stone crusher, but these stones are crushed into very small pieces because then they're used to lay out roads, right? And that's what these kids are doing. And we're speaking here about children who are obviously 6, 7, 8 years old. Extremely hazardous work, because when you engage in this kind of work, not only is it physically strenuous, but the dust from these stones over a long period of time, it enters into your lungs. Okay, it enters into your lungs, and mortality rates obviously are going to be exceedingly high for these children over here. All the images are that clear, but here you have a very young girl who's carrying a substantial load on her head. Look at these people over here. So what they're doing is they're carrying, this is outside a coal mine, and they're carrying a load which is probably not less than something like 75 to 100 pounds on their head of crushed coal. Okay, no helmets, nothing of that kind, no masks, no gloves, no protection. Here, yes.
Kind of curious, why do they carry it on their head? Why not just carry it out in front of them?
Oh, it's actually easier to carry it on your head.
The United States Army did a survey on the best way to carry a heavy pack, and they found that common.
Much easier, yeah.
I was just wondering, in terms of the definition of hazardous and unhazardous conditions,
Yeah.
is there within like the law or the Child Labor Act like a set definition for what is hazardous and what is
Yeah,
not hazardous?
there's a stipulation of what are considered to be hazardous activities and what are considered to be non-hazardous. So if you're working in a mining industry, if you're engaging in some kind of hard, strenuous physical labor, if you're dealing with toxic waste, all of this would be an illustration of hazardous, and then there would be non-hazardous, but it is defined under the law. It's defined under the law, yeah. So farm labor would be the best example, as I said. Domestic labor would be non-hazardous, right? So if you're working in a household as a maid, and many of these households that I'm talking about, they might be employing a girl who's 10, 12 years old, right? Yeah, okay. So we're just going to go through some of these images in quick succession. There are about only 10 or 15 in all, just so that you have a sense of what we're really talking about. And then we'll shift to that book that we have for this week and talk about that very briefly. These are children who are garbage pickers, something that you find in India and South Asia quite commonly. So these are big garbage dumps. Most of them are open. And you will find usually stray cattle. India has the largest population of stray cattle in the world. That's a whole another story in itself. What do you do with stray cattle? They have their different uses. There are different ways of doing cultural histories of stray cattle. Many streets do not need speed breakers because you're going to find cows sitting in the middle of the road. And when you find cows sitting in the middle of the road, well, you have to brake. So those are speed breakers. I've actually encountered the argument from some traffic engineers that the best way to control traffic in India and to make sure that people don't speed too much, especially young men with a lot of money who tend to buy fast cars, is you just make sure that you don't touch the cattle. Because if you hit a cow and you kill a cow, well, then there's hell to pay. Right? So this, anyhow, here's stray cattle, and these, more importantly, you've got kids now who are sifting through the garbage. Why are they sifting through the garbage? And again, of course, you know, I mean, much of this is toxic, and it could be fecal matter, all kinds of things over here. You sift the plastic out, and then you put the plastic in one huge bag, and you go sell it for a pittance, right? Or the scavenging might involve obviously sifting through the bottles, but usually in middle-class households, they would not be throwing out empty bottles because bottles can be sold. So the maid in the house would automatically do that already. So you're not really going to be able to get expensive material, expensive relatively speaking, through this huge garbage, pile. Okay, and when they come collect garbage, I mean, I've seen that in the colony. That's what we call neighborhoods, colonies, very often. In the colony that I have a home in Delhi, which is fairly well-to-do, I would say probably upper middle class kind of colony. I mean, even there, the people who come and they collect the garbage from each door, they're not wearing gloves even. Right? And we've often had a discussion, why not just give all of them disposable gloves? Something as simple as that. Right? And needless to say, no masks, nothing of that kind. But you'll find hundreds of images of this kind. Did you have your hand up? Yeah.
What happens if you hit a cow?
You'll run into trouble because of the reverence for cows. Right? The cow is a sacred animal, so depending on the context, if you hit a cow, a crowd might assemble very quickly, and if you haven't been able to flee by then, there's a good possibility that you're going to get more than a thrashing. Okay? It depends on the context. I mean, it may be a lynching, but it'll certainly be a thrashing. So it could be anywhere in that continuum from a thrashing to a lynching, depending on who you are. I mean, if you happen to be a lower caste person and you hit a cow, then the possibility that you might get lynched exists. Right? If you happen to be relatively wealthy, well, then you use your influence, you use your money to pay off people, so forth and so on, quieten the crowd. So it depends on the context. All right, now, and we're just going to continue to look at some of these images over here. So these are people who are working on the construction of a stadium. Of course, when you look at construction work in the U.S., then you say that, well, there are certain rules that have to be followed. And there are obviously zoning regulations in places in Indian cities. There's no question that there's zoning regulations and all of that. But here I'm talking simply about what kind of protection and security workers themselves actually have. And so these are people who are working on building the Jawaharlal Nehru Stadium in Delhi. Here's a woman who's, again, this is a stone crushing. This is a very common kind of work that you find in India. And you're going to find a large number of women. You can see from her clothes, under the armpit, her shirt is torn. obviously the fact that she's doing this kind of work itself shows you the class to which she very likely belongs. And if somebody said that what would be the caste that she belongs to, she almost certainly belongs to a lower caste. Class and caste do not always coincide. There can be people who can be upper caste but not be well off. So you could be a Brahmin priest in a village and you're upper caste, but you may be economically not well off at all. You might be living a very, very modest lifestyle, exceedingly modest lifestyle. But in a good number of cases, in preponderant number of cases, especially when you look at labor of this kind, then you should assume that class and caste will in fact actually coincide. Not only is she lower class, she's also lower caste, almost certainly. Right? Okay. There are certain kinds of labor, by the way, that Brahmins will not engage in for the most part. So because the cow is a sacred animal, so when you have a dead cow, where do you get your leather products from? From the hide, right? That's the kind of work that a Brahmin will not engage in. So it will be done either by lower caste people in India or it will be done by Muslims. Right? Those are the two communities that might be engaged in that kind of work. Yes, Dominic?
Will Brahmin wear the leather products?
Interesting question. Interesting question. Because in principle, no. In reality, yes. Very often they will. Very often they will, but there are stipulations. So for example, as a Hindu, if I wanted to go into a Hindu temple in South India, it depends. In North India and South India, there may be variations. Within South India, there may be variations. But for example, if I tried to go as a Hindu into a Hindu temple, okay, in an Orthodox city in South India, I would not be permitted to go in this way. I would not be permitted to go because I've got a leather belt. I'd have to take off my belt. I cannot have stitched clothes. You have to wear an unstitched garment, so I would have to take off my shirt, okay, so forth and so on. But now we're getting into a different set of questions. But the answer to your question is, there are obviously people who, in some ways, believe themselves to be entirely secular. In any case, right? So you could be born into the Brahmin caste, but you could, for example, I think of myself as a strict non-believer, so it wouldn't make any difference to me at all. But there are people who obviously are much more particular about these things. So in principle, the answer should be that no, they wouldn't, but I think that here you would have to keep in mind the distinction that I had made between the textbook view of caste and what happens on the ground. All right? And this is a man who's, so because here we're looking at labor, right? What do people do? What are the occupations in which they're engaged? Once you move outside the white-collar work, once you move outside the university professions, government jobs, corporate jobs, bankers, people who are working in financial investment, school teachers, those are all white-collar jobs. And all of those are jobs that we more or less understand. Right? But what about the hundreds of millions of Indians who are occupied in other kinds of labors? The Indian government actually has a list of occupations. It's a fantastic list. So for example, some of the occupations include ear cleaner. So if you go to a big city such as Delhi or Bombay, and you go to Connaught Place. So Connaught Place is this large place in the middle of the city, which has a large park. So there are a number of guys sitting there, and they clean your ears. You don't want to have that done, by the way, because the chances are you'll get an infection. So they'll use an implement which hasn't been cleaned in 10 years, and they'll poke it inside your ear and try to take out the wax. And whether they end up, damaging your eardrum, etc., we won't get into all of those, nice little details. Okay, but that's actually a profession listed, okay, in a list released by the Indian government of thousands of occupations that are practiced by people in India. So one of the occupations is, for example, monkey chaser, someone who chases away monkeys. If you go to Delhi, there's a large monkey population, and they're a nuisance. But again, you can't touch them. Why? Because Hanuman, right? Hanuman is the monkey god in the epic, the Ramayana, right? So he's a revered figure. And of course, your rationalist Hindu or your rationalist will say, ah, this is a wonderful illustration of the superstition of the Hindu, because this epic talks about a character called Hanuman, who's a monkey god, and therefore monkeys can no longer be touched. So, right, they'll say, but of course, this is one of the what you really have to do is you have to understand what is the nature of the relationship between humans and animals in any given society. That's what you'd have to start understanding. Because what have we done in the West? We have banished all animals to zoos except two creatures called cats and dogs. Everything else has been banished to the zoo. Oh yes, I know that there are pet, snakes and lizards that a few kids have, but in principle, what am I talking about? And of course, most people assume, oh, people have always had dogs as pets. Not at all. This is a bourgeois conception that enters into Western society in the 18th century. Just read a history of when these animals started to become domesticated. And people started keeping them inside their homes. No one did that in Europe in the 14th century, 13th century. This is a relatively new thing. Okay? But we have banished all the other animals. In India, I remember when my son was 3 years old, and we were going around, he said, because he loved zoos like all children do. And so here, of course, you took him to the LA Zoo. And then, you saw all these animals in sequence, the flamingos, the rhinos, whatever. In India, he said, my God, there's like a living, walking zoo in front of you. There are camels, there are elephants, horses. All of these animals are on the road. Right? So then you have to think about, well, is this just the superstition of the Hindu which prevents him from doing anything with the monkeys? Because monkeys can get very aggressive, I have to tell you. Particularly the rhesus monkey can get very aggressive. So you're eating a banana and he'll just come and snatch the banana from you. And it's happened with everybody in India. So there's a profession, it's called monkey chaser. All right? So we wanted to do the real labor history of India. We could spend a whole quarter just on going through each of these occupations, because some of them are fabulous and you've never heard of them your whole life. Right? And I've given you two illustrations of that. So this guy, what is he doing? He's selling something called a golgappa. Okay, golgappa is also called pani puri. If you go to one of these restaurants in Cerritos, they sell pani puri. That's what so these are these puffed up pastry balls, and then you stand on the corner, and the guy will puncture a little hole in that pani puri, and he'll put some water and some spices and some chickpeas, and it's a fantastic street food. But that's what he's doing. Of course, sanitation levels, appalling. You don't know where the water has come from. This is not, your Perrier mineral water that we're talking about. Okay? The guy probably hasn't washed his hands in God knows how long. He goes and he takes a pee outside, and then you think he's got soap with him, right? Yeah, all of these things you'd have to think about. And then you have to think about, why do people catch various kinds of diseases? 90% of all the improvements that took place in Western societies took place because of improvements in sanitation, hygiene, and nutrition. These three things. It is not the surgeries. That's very recent. 90% of all the improvement can be attributed just to those factors. And this is what you're not going to find over here, which is why when you go to Delhi, be prepared to get a Delhi belly after a few days. Okay? All right? And now, here we go. So here you've got a Monsoon. This man is pulling a rickshaw by his hands. The only city where you really find that is Calcutta. You don't find that in Delhi. All right? And there's been long a debate. There was a friend of mine who made a film, Man versus Man, it's called, 30 years ago, and it's on these hand-pulled rickshaws. And streets in India during the monsoon season, they get flooded within hours. The sewage system is in absolute disrepair. I think I made a quip about this maybe in this class, I can't remember. But we had a better sewage system in India 4,000 years ago when the Indus Valley civilization started than we have now. Okay? Because now the streets just get flooded. And so this man is actually pushing this obviously relatively well-to-do, affluent Indian, through the streets, and he's pulling him on a rickshaw. Okay? And there are obviously ethical questions. Do you want to sit on a rickshaw? Do you want to be pulled by another human being? And there are some people who will not take a rickshaw, and that's one reason why there are some people who have long argued that these rickshaws should be eliminated. Here's another image of something similar happening, right? And of course, when the waters rise, when all the garbage rises to the top, right? And here is these are cycle rickshaws. So again, another profession that is very common. Cycle rickshaws, pullers have an enormous problem. They have an enormous problem because they are harassed by the police. In order to run a cycle rickshaw in the city of Delhi, in Delhi it is estimated that there are about, if I remember correctly, about 80,000 cycle rickshaws, right? So a cycle rickshaw would be something that you might take. So let's say your closest metro stop was half a mile away, and you might take the cycle rickshaw from there to your destination, which is half a mile away. Okay, these cycle rickshaws, you need a permit in order to run a cycle rickshaw. Now, what does a cycle rickshaw wala do after 10 p.m.? So let's supposing it's like driving a cab here in this sense. I was speaking to a cab driver very recently, and this cab driver told me that it happened to be a woman. This cab driver, there are very few women who are cab drivers. Less than 1% of the United States of cab drivers are women. Okay, but she told me that, well, actually the place that she rents a cab from is 40 miles away from her home, right? So, you have to include that now. You have to factor that time that it takes her to drop the car and then drive her own car from the garage. Now, similar question here. Where is he going to park the rickshaw at night? Okay, is he going to park it just on the street? Because if he parks it on the street, technically it's illegal. And then what is a cop going to do? He's going to, and cops don't ticket these people, they just extort money. Ticketing means there's actually some official record, right? They're giving you a piece of paper and there's an injunction that you have to pay such and such. No, these people never get ticketed. They just have to face extortion because the policeman is just going to come to him and say, well, you better shell out 10% of your income for today. Otherwise, I'm just going to confiscate this rickshaw because you parked it illegally, right? Most of them will sleep on their rickshaw for the night, most of them. Right? So if you go through certain neighborhoods late at night, 2 a.m. you're walking, you'll see a whole bunch of rickshaws lined up there, and the men are just sleeping on the rickshaw themselves. And you think that this rickshaw is being created for 2 people. Just see how many people get seated in South Asia on a rickshaw. All right, school children are very often going to be taken. Here you go. All right, so you know how many kids there are over here? We're talking about 10 kids. And typically, lots of children will go to school this way. And we're not talking about, slum children. We're not talking about slum children. We're talking about children who are coming from at least something like an upper lower class family or a lower middle class or even middle class family in some cases. Very common. 10 kids going to be transported on a rickshaw because what he's done is he's folded the backside, and then of course, safety precautions, all of that. I mean, when I read all the reports about airbags exploding here, I just have to chuckle in a way because I think about this. I mean, this is like 50 times as hazardous, and everybody is going through that in South Asia. This is not just India again. This is a common scenario over South Asia. Okay? In Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, all of these countries. You will see, as I said again, this is a common sight on the streets of India every day. And to conclude this presentation, right, this man obviously belongs to a low caste community. He's the lowest of the low in terms of his socioeconomic strata. You know what this is? This is a sewer that he stepped into. Because there's some problem, so they've dug out the hole, okay, and he's stepped into it, no protection whatsoever. Because there's some problem, and he's got to probably use his hands to weed out the junk, or clog something up, or open up some drain, whatever the case might be. Right? And again, strictly illegal. There is an elaborate set of laws which guide, India officially about these kinds of things. None of them is ever followed. None of them has ever been implemented. Right? And this is going to be, again, not an uncommon sight. You're not going to find it that often, obviously, in a place like Delhi. If you do, it will be in one of the poorer neighborhoods. And here he's gone all the way down this man, okay? Right? And you can see the manhole cover on the right. They've just removed it, and he's just been lowered into this in order to fix whatever problem it is. My idea here is not to show you simply the ugly side, because we started out with the malls. So if somebody said to me, I know that I've been accused all too often, oh, I only show the ugly side. Well, that's not the point, because I've tried to argue that, in fact, this is a working experiment that we have in India with democracy. We're talking about very unusual conditions. We're talking about a massive population. We're talking about the fact that there are institutions such as caste, which are entrenched, that there are systematic and systemic forms of discrimination, some of which go very far back in time. It's also worthwhile keeping in mind. And I want to just tell you something. It might seem completely unrelated, but it's not, because I want you to understand again, exactly as I did when we were talking about communal conflict. You remember what I said to you when we were talking about communal conflict? That the overwhelming impression created here, for example, if you read the New York Times, is that India is engulfed by communal riots all the time, and people are just fanatics and killing each other because Hindus don't like Muslims and Muslims don't like Hindus. And I said, how many people actually died of communal conflict in 2012? 750. And that's the number of people who were killed in the United States every day on account of gun violence. Every day, 750. That's one way in which you start putting things in contrast. So let me give you a little story here, which will be one way to understand what are some of the issues that we're talking about, which is because some of them are particular to India. And I want you to see for yourself what are some of the problems here. But some of them have to do with long-standing problems and ways in which other countries and other systems are implicated, and we don't even understand that. We don't even remotely know that. What is the illustration here that I want to give you? In the 1880s, South India went through large famines. India was under colonial rule at this time. Remember, the British left India in 1947. Right? That's when India acquired independence. So 60 years before the end of colonialism, if you go to South India went through massive famines. And when I say massive, I'm talking about mortalities. Mortality numbers we're talking about 5, 10, 15 million in some parts of South India. Okay? Now, during those days, one of the things that the colonial government introduced was what are called public work projects. So it also ties it in with labor history. And that, in a sense, is what Narega is. I don't know how many of you remember my discussion of Narega. I had a fairly extensive discussion about Narega, right? So Narega is a National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And you remember that I had discussed this act, because what does this act do? This act says that one person from every family in rural India is entitled, at least one person, to 100 days of paid wages for work. So how do you implement it? You introduce a public works project. What does a public works project mean? It means, for example, repairing roads. Okay, building a ditch for a canal, to introduce an irrigation facilities in that particular, those are public work projects. In the United States, what was the big period for public work projects? FDR, 1930s, the Depression. It started with the Depression, public works project. Okay? Now, in India, in the 1880s, 1890s, when these famines are taking place, the government introduces public work projects. But one of the things that the colonial government was trying to do, it was trying to figure out what is the fewest calorie count that is possible when you employ a person on a public work project. So let's say we want to employ Vinay on this public work project. Okay? And let's say that we say that he's going to work for 14 hours. Can he work those 14 hours on 600 calories? Right? So you keep on experimenting and you find the lowest calorie count, not the highest, the lowest. So in other words, if you're feeding Vinay 700 calories, an official might say, well, let's see if we can actually give him 650 calories and if he can still continue to work for 14 hours a day without falling dead, and continue to do it for 6 months. So they determined upon a figure, I don't remember the exact figure, I think it was something like 625 calories, that you could actually get a person to work on one of these public work projects on 625 calories. You know what the recommended calorie allowance is in the United States, right?
2,000 to 2,000.
Yeah, 2,000 to 2,200 basically. It's in that's the figure that they recommend for a grown person, okay? 2,200. So 625 calories they determined. Now, the most chilling part of the story, and I can guarantee you've never heard of it because I didn't hear of it until I read it in a book by Mike Davis, Late Victorian Holocaust. When the Nazis were setting up their concentration camps, one of the things they read were the famine reports from India in the 1880s. So when they were setting up Auschwitz, right, they were setting up Auschwitz because you know that Auschwitz was not just a camp which gave a machinery, which orchestrated a machinery of death. It did that, but it was a labor camp. Auschwitz was actually a labor camp. And of course, then they had the gas chambers and they had extermination, so forth and so on. And Auschwitz is, of course, a synonym for the Holocaust. There were other camps as well, but this has become the synonym for the Holocaust. So one of the things that these Nazi officials were trying to do was they were trying to figure out how long can you make a Jew work? On 500 calories, 600 calories, 700 calories. What is the minimum number of calories we need to give him in order to make sure that he works from 6 a.m. in the morning until midnight without falling dead? Because you don't want to give so few calories that he can't survive, because then, of course, he's useless. Right? It's a labor camp. So you want to give the minimum number of calories that allows a person to work for that long. Okay? An astonishing thing, right? That these Nazi officials are reading these famine reports from India from the 1880s to figure out exactly what colonial officials were doing in India. And by giving you this example, I am by no means trying to suggest, not even remotely, that colonialism is to blame for everything that you've seen here, including this man going into the sewer, all of that. No. But I'm saying that, A, you've got systemic problems of discrimination, okay? And there have been attempts, but these attempts have not been genuine, to implement, to have legislation that would obviously try to correct some of these wrongs. Some of these wrongs are wrongs that go back for generations, and that's what the Dalit struggle is about. Because who's the guy who's going to go into that? It's not going to be your Delhi University educated person who's going to walk into that sewer. Right? It's going to be people who belong obviously to the lowest rungs of Indian society. And these are people without any protection. And I'm saying these are long-standing problems, it's a systemic problem, but I also want to suggest to you that we have to understand that there are forms of discrimination that, in fact, are not particular to India. They're not particular to India. There are long, convoluted histories of how societies begin to discriminate against a certain group of people. Okay? And that's what we should, in some ways, attempt to understand. And education will not necessarily, this is again the liberal view. The liberal view is that education is the solution to all of these problems. I've heard this from a lot of activists in India. Well, it was actually the fact that the Jews were highly educated which made them the targets too. That in proportion to other members of European society, the Jews were always much more highly educated, even though there was systematic discrimination against them. And the fact that the Jews were relatively well integrated, for example, they're more integrated into German society, which is where the Holocaust is thought out. Right? So you would expect that there would be less of a problem for Jews in Germany because they're relatively more integrated they are in Germany than they are in France. Right? And of course there was a history of anti-Semitism in all of Europe, not just in Germany or in France. Anti-Semitism was rampant. But the fact that they were highly educated, comparatively speaking, the fact that they were integrated did not save the Jews. And this goes back to the question of, well, how do we address problems of inequality, right? So what do we do with the Dalits? How do we enhance, how do we ensure that they have some kind of place in Indian society, so forth and so on. And one answer that was given by people like Ambedkar, and that has been given by a number of Dalit activists, is, well, we have to increase intermarriage, caste intermarriage. And I suggested to you that, well, that there might be some merit to that argument, but we shouldn't accept it in toto, because we'd have to seriously look into that claim. Right? And similarly, I think we would have to look into these histories in all kinds of ways to understand how is it that a society arrives at this particular stage. Right? How do lives lose their value? Do some lives value more than others? Right? That's, I think, the central question that we have to, in some ways, think about. And I think this is actually an apt time to do it, considering what's happening in Ferguson, because that's partly what Ferguson is about. It's about, do some lives matter than other lives? Okay? Let me now just turn very briefly to that book by Aman Sethi, A Free Man. The reason why I gave that reading to you, I could have given you a much more scholarly reading. I could have given you 3 really dry articles on the history of labor laws in India, okay, and history of child protection. You know, the person who won the Nobel Prize, you know, there are 2 people who won the Nobel Prize. I've talked about it in this class this year, the Nobel Peace Prize. And one of them is an Indian activist who has worked for years on the question of child labor, okay. And you have phenomena such as child labor and bonded labor. So what is bonded labor? Bonded labor is 3 generations ago, my father takes out a loan. And usually when you take out a loan, and this is from a private lender, right? The state has nothing to do with it. This is an agreement between the person who's taking the loan and the money lender, right? Usually the rates of interest are exorbitant. So your credit card and rate of interest is about 20% in America on the average, about 20%. This might be 30, 36, 50% interest. Okay? So you take out a loan, you're not able to pay it back, and effectively what you do then is you sign an agreement saying that my child will now be working for you. And this may go on for generations. Now, bonded labor is illegal. And you have entire organizations which are dedicated to the eradication of bonded labor. So there's this person very well known in India, his name is Swami Agnivesh. So he's actually the head of a organization, which is an organization which is dedicated to freeing bonded laborers. Okay? So if you, I'm just giving you his name because if you were interested, you could just type his name into Google and you'll come up with a whole lot of information about him. And he's not the only one who does this kind of thing. But what does Swami Agnivesh do? He'll lead a group of people to a site where he knows bonded laborers are being employed. What might that site be? It might be one of those sites where 50 people are working, crushing stones, just breaking them into smaller pieces. All right? And some of those people working there are bonded laborers. And when we say bonded, they are under a bond. Their father or their forefathers basically sold them into slavery, effectively. Now, it's illegal. So Swami Agnivesh might lead a group of people there and they might say, we're going to free you. Of course, then you have to say, well, what exactly is the mechanics of it? So you remove this person who's a bonded laborer. Well, how do you rehabilitate them? Where do you send him? Do you have a place for all of these bonded laborers that you can send them to? You know, we can get into all of those kinds of questions then. Right? But I'm simply saying that there is this phenomenon that we call bonded labor. So we have talked about child labor, we have talked about bonded labor, we have talked about labor in the unorganized sector. And the other illustration I've given you as part of a recent trend in the labor history of India is people who work in call centers, for example, okay? Which in my view is another form of servitude, because you have to change your whole lifestyle and you have to change your rhythms of your life. You have to stay up all night so that you can actually take the calls from people who are calling from here in the morning, right? These are what you know, the word, I don't know if you've ever heard the word coolie. So coolie is a word that is used to describe these people who were indentured laborers as they were called. So what we have in India now are cyber coolies. That's the word I would use. These are coolies who are working in the cyberspace age. Okay. So those are illustrations. But why did I have this book rather than those dry articles? Not because I think the book is a masterpiece. In fact, I'm quite sure it's not. I don't think it goes far enough into some of these histories. But nonetheless, it has a good deal to say for itself. It has some merit. And the merit is it brings the lives of these people in front of you. Because what do we like to do to the poor? We like to hide them. We like to hide the poor. We like to hide poverty. It's a very unpleasant thing. Very few societies have the fortitude to attack the problem of poverty this way. Okay? And for Indians, it always used to be astonishing when you first came here and you saw that, hey, there were people who were homeless. Why are there any homeless people in the richest country of the world? Right? And why are these people largely invisible? They're invisible in the sense that, yeah, you and I have nothing to do with them. They do not form part of our everyday discourse. And of course, what is the definition of poverty in America? If you're not a consumer, you're poor, frankly. You have to be addicted to consumption in this country, and that's what makes you a member of this society. Consumption. You know, right? So what is he doing? What Aman Sethi is doing is he's bringing these people, he's saying, I'm going to give you these life histories. This is not in the abstract. This is what Ashraf is like. Muhammad Ashraf is like. This is what he does for a living. You know, and then you think, well, the guy is completely irrational because he makes very little money, and what does he do? For those of you who read the book, most evenings he blows it away on liquor, right? And you think to yourself, well, that's completely irrational. Why is he doing it? Why doesn't he save? Well, why would you want to save if you were in his position? You could ask yourself that. When did the idea of savings come in? Does this have some relationship to bourgeois society? Everybody starts to save, you know, right? Or you run up credit card debts. In America, you don't save, you run up credit card debts. That's more common. Yes?
But didn't Sethi say they didn't save? They had the tea shop guy holding your money.
Yeah, but I'm speaking in general. I'm not speaking about, you know, and what kind of savings are we talking about? We're not talking about thousands of rupees. You give this guy 50 rupees or 100 rupees so that you want to make sure that the next day, you've got a little bit bread or something to eat. Okay? You have to look at the nature of the argument that he's giving, because wouldn't you agree that there are lots of episodes which have to do with this guy blowing away the money on liquor, right? And then you have to ask yourself, well, what is that all about? Is this a sign of the fact that he's irrational, and he's irrational because he's uneducated? This is the usual liberal strand of thinking. What Aman Sethi is trying to do is he's saying, let me put some flesh on this person. He's got some desires, he's got some aspirations. Right? He wants to lead the life that he wants to. He's got some degree of freedom. Okay, he doesn't have all the protections that you and I have. He doesn't have a roof over his head, really. Okay? He doesn't know where his next meal is going to come from, but in some ways he's free. And that's what the title is about. Right? So the idea is not to hide the poor and the poverty. And I'll give you a different example of what it means when you want to hide the poor. So in India, in 2010, they hosted what are called the Commonwealth Games. Don't worry if you haven't heard of them, because nobody knows anything about the Commonwealth except the people who live in those Commonwealth countries, because it's a non-entity, this thing called Commonwealth. Commonwealth countries are those countries which belong to the British Empire at one point. Okay? And so in India you have the Commonwealth Games, because of course India doesn't have the facilities to hold the Olympics, nothing remotely resembling that, okay? Because it costs $15-20 billion to host the Olympics. So you host this watered down version called the Commonwealth Games. And here you don't have to worry about competing with the Americans and the Chinese, because then you're not going to win even a bronze medal. Now in the Commonwealth Games at least you can win a few gold medals. All right? These are all important things. We're going to talk about it in the last segment. Okay? So when they had the Commonwealth Games, I was there. I had moved back to India when I was teaching at the University of Delhi. And I saw this happening right in front of my eyes. So you've got the poor, you know what they do very often when they have this grand mega event. It's like when Barack Obama arrives in India. So the day before, what will they do? They'll shepherd all the poor out of the central part of Delhi where they know he's going to be going in his motorcade, right? You want to remove these poor people. Put them out in the suburbs, give them an injunction. You cannot be in the city for 72 hours. They'll do that. And then there are these slums, So I live in as I said, a upper middle class colony, but right outside is a slum. Okay? And when I say slum, I mean this is a settlement that is unauthorized. Okay? Unauthorized. Illegal construction. Of course, that's not what really concerns me. That's what concerns middle class people. They'll say, it's unauthorized. Who are the people who live in the slums? They're very often the people who come and work in your home. The gardener, the driver, right? They're the ones who are servicing your homes, effectively. The slum has no water supply. There may be one tube well for 1,000 people. Usually the electricity is stolen. It's hard for me to describe how that happens, but there's a way to do it. You can actually pilfer electricity through the lines and divert it, okay? And these people know exactly how to do it. And of course, as a consequence of that, they don't pay any electricity bills because they don't have any electricity, okay? Almost no toilet facilities, so it'll be open defecation somewhere in the back of the slum, okay? Now, what did they do when the Commonwealth Games? They brought these huge billboards and they put the billboards in front of the slum. So when you're driving by, all you see is the billboards. An ad for Gucci, okay, or Benetton, something like that, right? And you don't know that right behind it is a slum. That's what it means to hide poverty. And of course, the psychological question to ask is, what is it that you're hiding from yourself when you're hiding this poverty? Is this reflecting yourself, your culture? Is this a reminder that you were one of these people probably not so long ago? Something you don't want to be reminded of. Okay? Those are the kinds of questions that you have to begin to ask when you look at the question of the poor and poverty. So I think we're done for today. We're exactly one lecture behind because the next lecture will be on women and gender. But the last week, which was 2 lectures, we won't need 2 lectures for that, I know that, so we'll be caught up by week 10. Okay? And for next week, no class on Thursday, obviously. Wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. But next week, we do women and gender Tuesday, and then on Thursday, we're going to do public culture and that film. Okay? And I'll send out an email to all of you about